If you enjoy our content and think this is important material, the best compliment you can pay is by sharing this with your friends and family. This helps us out a lot. Also, if you enjoyed today's program, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to this podcast. We would love to hear from you. The Truth in My Days podcast is sponsored by the Truth in My Days ministry. Welcome to the Truth in My Days podcast, where we defend the Word of God against the challenges of men.
Hello all. Today we have Sonia interviewing John about literary dependence and the synoptic problem. This is looking at the process by which the gospel authors went about writing the gospel books. Given that the gospel books are so similar, particularly Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it raises the questions such as, do they copy each other? Are the similarities due to divine inspiration from the Holy Spirit? What do the evangelical scholars say about this? Is there something wrong with their approach? John will be looking to answer these questions and more. We are continuing from the previous episode today. We hope you enjoy.
This sounds like those linguistic trees where they try to relate all the different languages of the world, and eventually they come up with proto this and proto that, and you have to wonder, how did they just make that up? What evidence is there for it?
Yeah, I mean, you don't have to worry about having actual sources and actual evidence. You can be whatever you want. So now we have Q, which we're told dates to about the year 50, and one scholar says that there was 200 verses in Q. Another will tell you that there's 270, and then Q went into Matthew, which was written at Antioch in the year 85, but Matthew also used Mark. And he also used something called Antiochene tradition, and then he used the M source for 230 of his verses. And M dates to around 65, so he still wanted late, so that we don't have to see it as eyewitness testimony. Then L gives rise to Proto-Luke, and Q get together and give you Luke with a separate source for the first two chapters. It can become very, very, very complicated trees. Okay, when you get to, there's miracle and parable collections and oral transmission, which will give you an early strata of codified Q, which is then used for the Gospel of Thomas, and for the late strata of codified Q, and so on. And you end up, in this particular reconstruction, you don't get canonical Mark until the 4th century. And canonical Mark comes out of secret Mark. Secret Mark, we've talked about that before in one of our programs, it doesn't even exist.
Yeah, it's so secret that it's not even real.
They don't have a secret Mark. What they have was a supposed writing from a church father who mentioned it. And that's it. Like you don't have one actual verse of secret Mark. But secret Mark, you see, is more reliable than the Mark we have in our Bible.
Why do you think the church father mentioned it?
He didn't. You remember we went through it. It was a forgery made by this scholar, Morton Smith, I believe. We already went through that. It was an absolute forgery. There was no church father ever referencing it. So this is what we have now. This is our literary dependence, and enemies of the cause of Christ will use this. Okay, they need it. The core of this so-called standard model is Mark and Q. And then Mark was written first. Here's how Shabir Ali puts it, and he uses this for his debates. It's a starting point. It's an important one for him. And it's a useful one for him because the Christians will not argue because they believe this stuff as well. So you will say that Mark was written first, modern scholars tell us, and Matthew and Luke derive their material from Mark and from a gospel Q. Because it's not just the skeptics and critics who will say, we have bought into it. Hutchinson, in the Politically Incorrect Guide to the Bible, writes to us that most, but not all, modern scholars believe that the Gospel of Mark was likely written first in Rome in the late 60s AD, followed by Luke in the early 70s and Matthew in the late 70s, and then by John sometime in the 80s. And we've looked at the dates, and we know that this is nonsense. Liberal scholars often argue for later dates, and some conservatives argue for earlier dates, but the scholarly consensus is that Mark comes first. Because Luke and Matthew follow the basic order of events in Mark almost exactly, with a few minor changes, such as cleaning up poor Greek grammar and because there are big chunks of texts that are not in Mark, but are found word for word in both Matthew and Luke. So, think about that. Scholarly consensus, that's what it comes down to. This is why it's accepted uncritically by evangelical scholars, because they just accept whatever the consensus is. They go to seminary, they hear the consensus. Very few, if any, bother to ask, like, okay, what is this consensus based on? What's the actual evidence? Does the evidence actually support this consensus? The reality is it doesn't, but how many people actually ask? Now, Mark comes first because Luke and Matthew follow the basic order of events in Mark almost exactly.
Well, that doesn't sound very convincing, because that makes it sound like, okay, all three of them have the same basic order of events. So why should we say that they got it from Mark if they all have the same basic order?
Well, that's a good point. They all have the same basic order, which is not true, by the way. But if it were true, any of them could be. But more fundamentally, if they're recording history, wouldn't they all have the same basic order?
I guess unless somebody is going topically or something. And
Exactly. You could change it. And if you see a change, you could say, well, did one of them write topically? But if they're all the same, wouldn't you assume that if someone's writing, say, the history of the American Civil War or World War I, that the order of events would basically be the same?
Yeah.
But we take any two books on World War I and say, oh, look, they have the same order of events, so then one author must have copied another?
Well, I guess they probably, in modern history books, they probably went to the same primary sources or something.
Yes, they would have gone to the same primary sources. If we talk about World War II, some of them would have gone to actual eyewitnesses. All depends on how much later you're writing. But the point is, events, real historical events, happen in a certain order. So if people are writing the real historical events, then yes, independent writers would have the same basic order. In point of fact, Mark and Luke and John have pretty much the same exact order. Matthew's is somewhat different, and that's because Matthew does arrange things topically. Now, when they say it's cleaning up poor grammar, again, that's an assumption. Okay? If Matthew has better grammar than Mark, it's because Matthew was a tax collector. He's much more literate. He's much better at writing than Mark is. So if Matthew's looks better, it's because he wrote better, not because he changed Mark's grammar. These are not valid arguments. But again, this is what even your evangelical scholars will tell you. And then he goes on, Hutchinson, in piecing together the facts of Jesus' life and drawing upon the same or similar saying source Q. The evangelists sometimes differed as to where a particular saying should go. So here you have the acceptance of late dating, the acceptance that Mark came first, the acceptance that Matthew and Luke copied Mark, and the acceptance that they also used this Q document. So let's take a brief look now at this Q. What is it? Is it viable? So you recall that the idea behind Q is that Luke and Matthew both contain a great deal of what is in Mark, and they also contain a significant amount, about a quarter of their material is common to each other, to Matthew and Luke, but is not in Mark. So the idea was that if they copied Mark for that material, then this material that's not in Mark but is in Luke and Matthew was also copied from another document. Problem, of course, is we don't have such a document, and so they invented one out of whole cloth. And they call it Q for kele, meaning source. Now, you can find a lot of books on this. The Lost Gospel Q, for example, by Burton Mack, and it's not exactly lost. You can't lose what's there. It's kind of like a book on unicorns, and you can say, well, unicorns used to exist, but we just can't find them. They're lost now. John Kloppenborg, Q, the Earliest Gospel, an introduction to the original stories and sayings of Jesus. So you see, it's not just that there's a Q, but Q has to be the oldest and the original. Another one here, the Lost Gospel Q, the original sayings of Jesus, as Marcus Borg is the consulting editor. You have scholarly books, such as the Post-Mortem Vindication of Jesus in the Sayings Gospel Q. Now, we're going to look at this in a little more detail a little later, but notice two things. Here you have the Post-Mortem Vindication of Jesus. So one, They're already telling you why Q was written. In the Sayings Gospel Q, they're telling you what's in Q. Well, that's a neat trick. Since we don't have Q, how could you possibly know what's in it? And then we have here the Sayings Gospel Q in Greek and English, with parallels from the Gospels of Mark and Thomas. So you see here the Gospel of Thomas is being smuggled in. Now, we talked about that in another program. The Gospel of Thomas is a Gnostic Gospel written no earlier than AD 170, 175. It has no claim to authenticity. But you're going to have liberal scholars trying to claim that, yes, this is actually more reliable than the canonical Gospels.
So if we don't have any actual Q, what goes in these books?
Well, we're going to get to that in a moment. One more here from Maurice Casey, an Aramaic approach to Q. So not only we have no Q, and we're basing it on what's in the Greek texts of Matthew and Luke, well, hey, we can have an Aramaic approach as well. So it's not just like you looking for a unicorn now, it's now looking for an invisible pink unicorn, which is just like a picture of a pink unicorn, except invisible. So you're not going to find it. We have this one here, Excavating Q, the history and setting of the Sayings Gospel. Excavating Q, wow, that's like going to a unicorn graveyard to excavate some unicorns. Here's another one, J.M. Robinson, the Sayings Gospel Q, and you see on the cover, a little fragmentary manuscript.
What is that manuscript then, if it isn't Q?
I would guess it's a little piece of a biblical text, one of the small and early papyri of it. But again, if you don't know, you look at it and say, oh, Sayings Gospel Q, oh, look, there's a picture. And you're meant to think that it's Q, but they will not put an illustration of Q on it because there is no Q.
Well, that seems very deceptive.
I would think so, too. It would seem that way to me as well. And here's my favorite, the critical edition of Q. You know what a critical edition is?
Is that the edited one?
Yes, it's where you compare all the different manuscripts, such as we do with the Bible. We look at the manuscripts, we look at the variants where they differ from one another and try to decide which was the original.
How can you do that if there are no manuscripts?
Well, that's a neat trick, right? Because we don't even have one manuscript, so how are you going to prepare a critical edition of Q? Oh, out of your own imagination.
So it's basically like a work of fiction. Someone just made it up and called it that?
Well, exactly. So you'll start with taking the material that's in Matthew and Luke and not in Mark, and then from there on, you can just do whatever you want with it. You don't just put those things and say, oh, this is in Q, but you can start talking about recensions of Q and layers of Q and what was early Q material, what was late Q material. It's amazing what you can do when you don't have any actual evidence to constrain your imagination. For example, here is from James M. Robinson, professor of religion and director of the Institute for Antiquity and Christianity at the Claremont Graduate School. Now you ask what's in Q. According to James M. Robinson, this is what's in Q. This old sayings gospel was not like the canonical Gospels, so colored over with the charisma of cross and resurrection that the historical Jesus, though embedded therein, was actually lost from sight by the heavy overlay of golden patina. Now that's scholarly gobbledygook for what?
So I suppose they're saying that Q doesn't have a resurrection and Jesus is just a regular guy.
They're saying that, and as well, you see, they're assuming, or they're putting an entailment meaning here, that there was no resurrection. There was no cross, there was no resurrection. You see, that was embedded in the gospel books that we do have. You can't believe those. Those are fictitious. So the canonical gospels, you see, are full of these legendary accretions and embellishments, so much so that you can't even really know who the historical Jesus is. Good thing we have Q to tell us, eh?
Thank you, everyone, for listening today. Unfortunately, we have run out of time, but please join us for the next part tomorrow. Same time and same place. Thank you for listening to the Truth in My Days podcast with John Torse. If you like our content, please share this information with family and friends. It helps us a lot. We also would love to hear from you. You can reach us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube by searching Truth in My Days as one word again. Truth in My Days as one word. No spaces in between. Or reach us by email at info@truthinmydays.com. You may also visit our website for more comprehensive material and to learn more about our ministry. Our website is truthinmydays.com.